Alright, in this video we're going to be talking about the domain and range, and we're actually going to be talking about it more specifically with domain and range of a quadratic function. So just a quick review for domain. The domain is all the possible x values that are defined on a graph. And if we're talking about a quadratic, we're talking about all the possible x values on a quadratic. Now when you read the domain, I read the domain just like I would read a book. I read it from the left side to the right side, so left to right. So if you're doing the range is all the possible y values. And these are all the possible y values of a quadratic that we're going to be talking about today. And the way that I read the range is you're going to read it from the bottom to the top. Okay, so you're always going to go from negative to positive when you're doing the domain or when you're doing the range. And you're trying to figure out where it started and where is it going to. Okay, so I have a pretty basic quadratic parent function, y equals x squared, and we're going to describe the domain and the range. So when I think about the domain, I always start from the left and go to the right. Now, the graph does not necessarily stop because the grid stops on your paper. So you've got to analyze and interpret what is going on outside of the grid that you don't actually see. So if I'm talking about from left to right, I know my x values are going to continue and they're going to go to negative infinity. So negative infinity means they're going to just keep going and going and going and going. So they're coming from negative infinity on the left side. And as I continue, I'm going to be going to positive infinity because they're not going to stop. Just because I changed direction during that curve did not mean that I do not have x values there. I have x values at -6, I have them at -4, -2, 0, 2, 4, and so on. So my domain would read that it starts at negative infinity and goes to positive infinity. And we're talking about the x value, so we're going to put that in inequality notation. Alright, so my range. So my range, the way that I think about my range, I think about the bottom to the top. So when I do my range, first thing I realize is that my range does not start below a certain y value. And that y value there is 0. So my range starts at 0. And it's going to go up on both sides. So it's going up to positive infinity. So I'm talking about all values that are greater than 0. So all values that are greater than 0. So if I say greater than 0, I'm comparing that to my y value. Okay, so my range includes all x values between negative infinity and infinity. So all x values really, all real numbers for x. And my range is my starts at 0. So I have no values below 0 because there's not a graph below there. And I'm going to go greater than 0. So it's equal to 0 and goes greater than that. Alright, so let's look at a few examples and let's define those. So let's look at the domain and range here. So starting with the domain, again, that same scenario, we're going to read it from left to right. So even though my graph doesn't go further than the grid on paper, that doesn't necessarily mean it stops there. So my domain, it's coming from negative infinity and it's going to positive infinity. So negative infinity to positive infinity. There's nothing that stops. There's no x values that are not included here. So we have negative infinity to positive infinity. And we have x in between there to show my inequality notation. So the range this time is I'm looking at where that vertex starts, and that vertex is starting at that y value of 1. So it's a y value of 1 and it's going up to positive infinity. So my range here is everything greater than 1. So y is greater than or equal to 1. Alright, so for my next one, again, my domain is all my x values starting from negative infinity to positive infinity. So we're going from negative infinity to positive infinity here. So negative infinity to positive infinity, all real numbers. my range is starting at that that y value of 0. So we're going from 0 up. So my y is going to be greater than or equal to 0. Now, the next one looks a little bit different. My inequality is going in the opposite direction. That does not change the domain, however, because the domain is still, regardless that it's going down, down has nothing to do with domain. Domain is left to right. So it's still coming from negative infinity, and then it's going to positive infinity. It's going from the negative x's, and it's going to move to the positive x's. So my x values here are still going to be negative infinity to positive infinity. So negative infinity to positive infinity are all real numbers for my domain. Now my range is what is going to change a little bit here. So this time my range, I've got to think about it a little bit differently. My range is coming from the bottom this time, okay? So if I'm reading it from bottom to top, it's coming from negative infinity, and it's going up to the vertex point at -1. So it includes everything that is less than -1. So y is going to be less than or equal to -1. Now, if you needed to do this, you could always graph this in Desmos, especially if you were given an equation and do the exact same thing.